All of the wisdom of the past tells us the better we know ourselves, the less we fear. When we begin to understand the truth of who we are, the reasons that we hate begin to vanish. The moment I started speaking about spirituality as a scientist, I lost my credibility as a scientist. The fundamental rule of nature is cooperation. The more violent competition we see in the world, that tells us how far we have strayed from the truest laws of nature's harmony. As a geologist, what I could see is that we are living this rare convergence of three massive cycles of change that would be enough to turn the world upside down. Climate, economy, human conflict. We can't stop the cycles, but we definitely have the ability to determine how we respond.
It's up to us. And again, the individual change can actually change that future outcome.
We have a potential within us. And as we embrace that potential, we begin to think of ourselves very differently and see the world very differently. And to me, this is where the end of hate begins.
They say that the human race is doomed, that we have lost touch with our true nature, that the media has corrupted us, and that the planet has no future. I disagree. I believe that humanity is full of hope, and that our salvation lies within each one of us. My name is Brian Rose, and my job is to listen, the oldest method of learning known to man. Each week I seek out individuals that are changing the world, people who are living and thinking in a different way. Their stories will challenge your beliefs, make you question your choices, and perhaps inspire you to change. I never planned on doing any of this, but now I can't stop. Join me on this mission and make humanity something we can all be proud of.
The thing I love about Gregg Braden is he's got this incredible energy, this calmness, this peacefulness to him. He's actually a musician, and that makes sense. And he's here to tell us that in order to survive in all the chaos that's around us, we must think differently and act differently. And he's actually got this fascinating theory about three different cycles of human development. One is an economic cycle, one is a cycle of violence, and one is a cycle of climate change. And they're all converging right now. And Gregg has some really interesting ideas about how we can really be different people as we go through this change. He also has some ideas about human evolution and also the intelligence of the heart muscle. So I really think you're going to enjoy Gregg. Again, I really enjoyed just being around him. He had this incredible energy that I know you will enjoy too. And inside London Real Academy, we're very busy right now because we are teaching people how to broadcast themselves, how to start their own podcast, connect with amazing people from around the world, and turn it into a business. Also, for the first of the year, we're starting our Life Accelerator. Come join us for 8 weeks and learn how to get a new diet, to get a new movement practice, how to meditate, practice gratitude and affirmations, and be the best you for 2019. All of that's happening inside the Academy. Here's a bit more about what we do.
London Real doesn't stop when the conversation ends. You see, that's when we get started. Because everything begins with a thought, and then comes the action. The London Real Academy is our global transformation platform. Here we bring together thousands of students from over 75 countries. Whether you want to build a profitable business from your passion, or learn to speak to inspire, or broadcast yourself with your very own podcast, or accelerate your life to become a high-performance person, we have the online accountability course and personal mentoring program that will make your dream a reality. Join us, and we'll take your life to the next level, together. Our next accelerator course is starting soon.
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Gregg Braden, the New York Times bestselling author, researcher, educator, and lecturer. You are known as a pioneer in bridging modern science, ancient wisdom, and human potential, who's been invited to speak in front of the United Nations, Fortune 500 companies, and the U.S. military. Your books include The God Code, The Divine Matrix, Fractal Time, Deep Truth, and your latest, Human by Design. Gregg, welcome to London Real.
Brian, I am thrilled to be here. I am so excited to have this conversation today. I have no idea where we're going to go, and I know it's going to be good wherever we go.
Good, I'm pumped as well. That's the best way to start these things. First of all, how is London treating you? What is it like when you land here? What's the energy of the city like?
I have to tell you, when I get my schedules and I see where I'm going to be, I get an Excel spreadsheet that has the city and what I'm going to be doing. And when I go down and I see London, I always get a big smile on my face. And a good feeling in my heart. I love this city. I love the people of this city. You know, it's hard to put my finger on exactly why. There's a vibe. It just feels good to be here. I think a lot of your viewers know that when I'm not doing what I'm doing now, I'm also a musician, and London is a very happening music scene. But it's also a hub for consciousness, and people are willing to converge in this city from all points of the earth. They will come here from Brazil and Argentina and Chile and Kuwait and Dubai and Beijing for the programs that we do here, because I think they feel what I feel when they come here, and it's feels like coming home. It's a good feeling.
Yeah, for me, it's like a real melting pot. You know, you'll hear all different kinds of languages. People will wear whatever they want, and it's just kind of this hub for a lot of, you know, Europe and parts of the world. And you know, I'm here for a reason. I quite like it. But it's always interesting to hear what Americans think in the vibe. You know, you mentioned music. How does that play in who you are? You know, the whole music side of it, because we know you mostly for your work and your books. Sure. How does that play into how you learn, how you communicate, how you feel things?
Well, you know, I'm in my mid-60s now, so I'm the sum of all of my experiences. And to answer that question, I have to tell you a little bit about my childhood. Can we go there?
Yeah, let's do that.
I was born in a very conservative community in rural Missouri, northern Missouri in the U.S., into a very dysfunctional family, abusive alcoholic family. And music was a refuge for me, became a refuge very early in my life. Music and books. And those two facts are keys to where I am and what I'm doing right now. Music, I remember I had an experience, 1968, two experiences in the same month. I went to my first rock concert. It was Jefferson Airplane. Sat in the front row. I confessed my love to Grace Slick, and she completely ignored me, but the lead singer of Jefferson Airplane. But I saw for the first time, I saw those few people on the stage moving the hearts and the souls and the bodies of 30,000 people in the stadium through something that they were sharing. And I recognized that was happening, but I also recognized, Brian, that when everyone left, something was missing. They needed to have an external trigger to help them relive the experience. They needed the album. In that case, it was vinyl. They needed that to play it and hear it again. At the same time, on television, I had the opportunity to see an evangelist speaker. His name was Billy Graham.
Yeah, sure.
I wasn't so much into his message, but I was powerfully moved by what he was doing in an open stadium, 70,000 people. He moved their souls. And when those people left, and I know people that were there at that particular event, when they left, they did not need to have an album or something external to bring back what happened to them in that stadium, because through his words, he found a way to reach something deep inside of them, and they were changed in his presence. So they didn't need the external trigger. And at that time in my life, I was saying, I'd like to contribute to this world in some way, through music or through words. And when I saw the power of the words to literally change the way that people think of themselves and see the world, I said, I think that will be my path, and the music will be my hobby. And music has been a powerful, it's a balance for me. It's writing. I'm a composer, singer, songwriter, guitar, electric guitar, acoustic guitar, folk, rock, blues, everything. And it uses a different part of the brain. Actually, in my office, I have a very complex office. I have the working office space. I have the yoga, martial arts, exercise space, and I have a music studio all in one area. Typically it's all in one area. And what I find myself doing is when I'll be writing, 8, 10, 12 hours a day, researching a book or something, there's a point where I will get up and pick up that guitar, and it just shifts to a completely different part of the brain just for a moment. And in that moment, there's a freedom that comes, and an openness, and an emptiness. And in that emptiness, I can be full. In the emptiness of letting go of ideas and thoughts, I can be full for whatever is present for me, and go back and begin writing again. So the music has continued to this day to be a very powerful, I don't want to call it just a factor. It's a force, a very powerful force in my life.
And do you find the same with physical movement as well? When you go over
Absolutely.
and engage with that, your brain goes into maybe another space?
If you've ever seen me in presentation mode, you've never seen me sitting on a stage. I'm always standing, I'm always in motion, because it is the motion that moves the energy. And I had someone ask me in an interview recently, Gregg, how do you remember everything that you remember when you're on the stage? And I said, I was surprised at the question, first of all. And I said, I couldn't possibly remember everything. I have no idea. I know what the slides in a presentation will look like. I have no idea what I'm going to say. And that's why every presentation is different, because it is being present in the moment with the people, in the hearts, in the minds, in the souls in that room. And my mantra, literally, as I walk from backstage out onto a stage, my mantra to the universe is, I become empty so I can become full. In my emptiness, I'm present for whatever is needed in that moment. And that's where the magic happens. And the same thing happens with music. Same thing happens with music.
And when you move, martial arts and yoga,
yes,
you probably go to another space, or?
It's always been, it's the integration of mind and body and spirit together. Martial arts, not for the purpose of necessarily of self-defense, but it's the purpose of the discipline. I've always been drawn to the discipline of yogic traditions. I've spent much of my adult life researching in some of the most remote and isolated and beautiful and magnificent and mystical places remaining on the earth today. Most of them are high elevation, high altitude. And I love high elevation. I live in high elevation. And in those cultures, every one of those cultures are things they all share. They all share, you and I have talked about this, they all have tea of some kind, and I love and collect tea. They all have music. And typically it's a wind instrument. I collect the flutes I have I've got a huge flute collection from every culture that I've ever been to, and they all have a form of movement. So I have adapted for my personal use, it's an amalgam of different kinds of movements. People will say, what practice do you do? And it doesn't have a name per se, because it is an amalgam of what I've learned from the people in Tibet and the people in the Andes and native traditions in the desert Southwest. But the movement, to me, it's key to honor. And that's the word that comes to me every time that I do this, to honor the presence of the soul in the physical body and that integration. And without that movement, I think that's where the stagnation begins.
Yeah, well, you're obviously doing something right, because you look great. Gregg.
Well, I've been traveling. I'm a little jet lagged today, so thank you.
Well, you wouldn't know, but human movement is something we talk a lot about on this show, and there's a great mover named Ido Portal who gets people to move. I try to move every single day now, and again, I do feel like it's an honor. I kind of have to honor my own body and make sure that I go through those paces and do these things that sometimes start to be uncomfortable, and sometimes later they become more comfortable. And martial arts is also something that I've been fascinated with most of my life. As a young man, sometimes you go in thinking, I'm going to learn how to beat someone up, and then you realize, actually, I'm learning about humility and respect and learning about all these other things that the martial arts bring. And
for me, the martial arts was my introduction to meditation. Okay. Something happened to me on my 21st birthday. I was living in northern Missouri. I woke up the morning of my 21st birthday. I remember it very clearly. Something clicked, something changed within me. And on that day, I became a distance runner. On that day, I literally went that day and registered and enrolled in my first martial arts class, and it was self-defense. It was a karate class being taught by a Special Forces vet from, at that time, the Vietnam era, that was all about, it was about warfare. And on Mondays and Wednesdays. Tuesdays and Thursdays, I enrolled in another class of judo, which was all about playing. My instructor would say, "Do you want to play judo?" It's just a completely different mindset. But I remember my first day, it was Bushidokan, karate. And then my first day in the dojo, he said, "Okay, we will do a meditation on the mat before we begin." So all the students, we kneeled on the mat for about 3 minutes. And he introduced a meditative technique, and he says, "Okay, let's begin." And I said, "Well, wait a minute. Can we just stay in the meditation for a little bit longer? Because something very beautiful is happening there."
Right.
And he
and
said,
back then, that must have been very novel.
It was, and he looked at me and he said in a little bit of a condescending way, he said, "Son, if the meditation is what you're drawn to, you're in the wrong class." But that was my first experience of meditation, and it was 1980s. I began studying yoga with a Sikh mystic in Denver, Colorado, and it was still considered at that time in the 1980s, the Cold War era, it was considered a cult. And I remember there was a coworker who would go to the classes with me who could not tell his wife and family what it was he was doing because of the stigma that was attached to yoga during that time. But
yeah, people forget kind of what it was like back then, pre-internet, where a lot of ways you hear about this as a book being passed around or going here and going there. A lot of weird fears around that kind of thing.
Brian, you think of the world that we live in now and how far we've come from the world we were in, the change that's accelerated in just a few decades. I mean, it is truly mind-boggling when you, not only the technology, again, as a musician, we've gone from very thick vinyl to 8-track tapes and cassette tapes and CDs, and now we're digital, and I think from here we go quantum. I think quantum music is probably where we're going next. It's what they're working with, quantum encryption. I think the music will be the same. It's happened in a single lifetime.
Yeah, I know, it's incredible. Well, I want to talk a little bit about your journey and maybe even talk about some of those Cold War days as well, because I still remember going to sleep at night as a kid and worrying about a nuclear war, And,
me as well.
And I'm a bit younger than you, but a lot of people don't know that concept, and maybe we can get into that because that talks a little bit about your journey and how we got.
Well, it was a powerful influence for me. I remember in Missouri, 1960s, black and white television. And I remember seeing the very famous film of Nikita Khrushchev taking his shoe off, pounding it on the podium, saying, "We will bury you." And he was looking at me on the television. And this was symbolic of the Cold War between former Soviet Union and the former United States, because neither one are the same country anymore.
Right. This was like Cuban Missile Crisis time, right?
And the whole concept of nuclear war and mutually assured destruction. I remember we would go through drills in our classroom where you would get into your desk and hold your head in a certain way, like that's going to do something, if there's a mushroom cloud in your backyard. But we went, we lived through that. An entire generation lived through that. When I found myself, I'm a degreed geologist, and I worked as a geologist during the first energy crisis of the 1970s. And when the oil industry changed, I was in Denver, Colorado, and I didn't want to leave Denver. So I applied for an aerospace position because I wanted the science. I wanted to study the stars and human potential in space. And I was hired by an aerospace company. And they said, "Okay, you have a job. And we will give you an unclassified position for 6 months while you go through a background check for security. And then you'll have your job." So we did that. 6 months later, I got my security clearance, and they said, "Well, this is the Cold War. We need you on the security defense side of the house." And I began working on the defense side under something called Star Wars Initiative.
Where was that? In Los Angeles?
During the Cold War years. Star Wars this is where, it was an insane time.
Yeah.
It was an insane time. This was the very futuristic technology that was being deployed in space at the time. Lasers and mirrors, bouncing lasers off of one another and things like that. But I have to say, it was hard for me. I went through a lot of nights, sleepless nights, like, why me? Why am I in this position?
Why? Because you weren't comfortable being part of this?
Because I've always had such an aversion to war, and the great wars of the past have triggered something within me, and I have a sense of what that's about, another conversation, but the idea of using the technology to take the lives of civilians on such a massive scale And as I was working, I was a software developer for launchpad technology for missiles during the Cold War by day. And at night, I've always been drawn to the wisdom of the past. I was researching our most ancient and cherished texts and spiritual traditions, believing, as I believe today, that if we know where to look and how to look in the past, Brian, our ancestors left us the wisdom and the clues to change the way we think, so that we would never find ourselves in the kind of wars that we found ourselves in the 20th century. I mean, World War II, 60 million lives. I don't even know what that number looks like. Were lost. We came so close during the Cold War era to doing the unthinkable and unleashing nuclear weapons on civilian populations. And we had arsenals that are just ridiculous enough to microwave the planet many times over. Why would we ever allow ourselves to go to that place? And how can we avoid doing that again? And my feeling was that if we know where to look and how to look, we could do that. And all of the wisdom of the past pointed to the same thing. It says the better we know ourselves, the less we fear change in the world, the less we fear one another, and the less we fear our own power. And as we embrace our own power, we feel less need to exude that power externally in terms of the kinds of things that we've seen in the past. So that was a very powerful, a pivotal moment in my life, the Cold War years, to hone. Not only is the past interesting, but I think it's vital. There's a continuity of knowledge and wisdom, and we are part of that continuity. And what the new discoveries are showing is that history is cyclic, it's not linear. And we are most definitely in a cycle, repeating a cycle from the past. And the question is, are we going to make the same mistakes today that we've made in the past with the advanced technology that we have? And we're, you, me, our audience, our nations, we're deciding to answer that question right now.
And it's up to us. And again, the individual change can actually change that future outcome.
It doesn't take many people to actually change, and especially with the internet, with digital communications, very few people introducing ideas, new ideas. There's an openness now that I have never seen in my lifetime to embrace new ideas. When it appears that everything is set in stone, you know, it looks like everything's all buttoned up and locked down, it's very hard to introduce new ideas. When the world is in chaos, which is what we're experiencing right now, people are primed, they are ripe for new ideas, and it's very easy for a single idea, if it is well thought out, if it is honest, truthful, factual. In my case as a scientist, if it's based on scientific principles, not just theory or hypothesis, but real science, there is a willingness to embrace those ideas. And that's what myself, my dear friends, colleagues, spiritual brothers, people like Joe Dispenza, Dr. Bruce Lipton, many others, in our own ways, we found that openness is here, and we've dedicated our lives to sharing what we have come to know with the people who are open to listening to it. And we're also very honest. What we have come to know is changing because science is designed to be constantly updated. It's not a static knowledge system. So what I'm saying today will be even a little different from the book that I published last year, because we now know more than we knew when that book was published last year. I think it's really important to be honest and truthful and factual when we're sharing this information. But all of it tells us, number one, we're not what we've been told. Number two, we're more than we've ever imagined. And number three, that we have as individuals and collectively a potential that is so grossly untapped. We have a potential within us. And as we embrace that potential, we begin to think of ourselves very differently and see the world very differently. And to me, this is where the end of hate begins.
You know, we're actually on a project. We've made about 4 documentary films so far at London Real, and our next project is called Dissolution, Beyond the Ego. And we're trying to look at what's happening in the world right now, and this rise in tribalism and maybe the abuse of the environment, and trying to think, you know, how can we get to terms with our own ego and try to find out if there's a way where we don't have to have, like you said, this repetitive cycle of this destruction, and start trying to introduce some new ideas by people like you and the other gentleman you mentioned, and anywhere else, to try to find out, what we can do to kind of course correct us.
Can I speak to that
Yeah,
just a
please
little
do.
bit? This is where my training, I believe there are no accidents. It's no accident that I began as an earth scientist earth science is about huge cycles of time. It's not about right now, it's about huge natural cycles that tell us where we fit right now into those big cycles. It's no accident, I think, that I ended up working in the corporations because it taught me how people think when they are in fear, how they think in times of war. It taught me about how to train. Part of my job was training Air Force cadets on software, and some of them didn't want to learn the software. And so I learned about interfacing with people, and all of those principles I use in the work that I'm doing right now.
Steve Jobs says, connect the dots in reverse, right?
Yeah, I believe that. So when I began looking in 1970s, I was looking at geologically at the cycles of the Earth, and at that time there was a concerted effort to keep the scientific boundaries in place. So if you study chemistry, it's in a box. You study archaeology, it's in a box. Geology, anthropology, it's in a box. And I said, nature doesn't work that way. We've got to cross those traditional boundaries because there's a story, and the story is what we're living. So as a geologist, what I could see is that we are living this rare convergence of three massive cycles of change that very few people are talking about in the mainstream media. Bruce Lipton and I shared it at the United Nations. You mentioned that in the intro. Any one of these three cycles would be enough to turn the world upside down on end. And the fact that all three are converging right now tells us why the change is happening, why there's an openness for new ideas. The three cycles, one we are very aware of is climate. And if only climate were happening, climate change, that'd be enough to change the way we think, the way we grow our food, the way we share resources, the way we interact with one another. There's an economic cycle, 67-year economic cycle that is completing, and by definition a new one is beginning. And if we don't know that, if we're still thinking about economies, and this isn't only about money, it's about people and the way people work together, share information and share resources, that's part of the economy. If we are still thinking the way we're thinking 10 or 15 years ago, that's where the struggle and the suffering comes from. The third cycle is fascinating to me, and the United Nations had never heard of this cycle, and I was amazed because I would think that they would. It is a cycle of human conflict. And they said, what do you mean? Doesn't it just happen when it happens? And I said, well, actually, what the science shows is that human conflict ebbs and flows following the rhythms of magnetic fields between the sun and the earth and the human heart. Now, this is where it gets into what's called forbidden territory for science. But the human heart is the strongest magnetic field in the human body. It's about 5,000 times stronger than the brain. And what we know, the science is showing us very clearly, peer-reviewed science, is that when the magnetic fields of the earth are strong, we are more cooperative and much less aggressive. And the reverse is true when the magnetic fields are weak. And we are now in a weakening cycle that peaks in the year 2020. So it doesn't mean that we must have conflict. It means that we are vulnerable and susceptible. And if you look at the charts, the ebbs and the flows of the great wars in the past, when they begin and when they end, they also end when these cycles, at the peaks and the valleys of these cycles. It means we are now living the greatest opportunity for peace because of our vulnerability, if we have the wisdom to recognize that and not succumb to the forces and the impetus for conflict. So the fact that all three of these are converging right now, that tells us, people say, what's going on? This is what's going on. What do we do about it? You can't stop the cycles, but we definitely have the ability to determine how we respond to those cycles. And that's what myself, my colleagues what we're sharing is how we have the opportunity to awaken our inner power, because we are self-referencing beings. So what I mean by that is we are taught to determine our well-being based on the physical, the external world. When the world out here is okay, we feel pretty good. When that world begins to change, if we don't know who we are, that change can be frightening. So right now, we are globalizing the planet. We're mushing together cultures, religions, people, ways of men thinking about women and women thinking about men. We're pushing ourselves together on the one hand, but we're asking ourselves to embrace that change through a thinking that's obsolete. On the other hand, the better we know ourselves, the less we fear strange cultures to us, the less we fear the unknown. The better we know ourselves, the less we fear our own power. And as we embrace our inner power, we're much more comfortable with the external change because we're no longer threatened. So this is what our ancient traditions have told us. The geology helped me to see the natural rhythms that are playing out on the big scale. And the new science, biology, the new science, neurology has helped me to see what that means in our personal lives individually. And so I've done my best to bring those together to a story, and that's what I'm sharing.
What's the reaction of like the United Nations and some other people when you try to explain these cycles and the magnetic pieces? And do they know what to do with it?
Well, when we're in those conferences or those situations, I've learned to use different language at different times. I'm sharing with you and our viewers a lay language I'm very comfortable with. But I'm also talking about some terms that may not be familiar. When we're at those conferences, we have images, illustrations, and very simple language that we're using. And it was interesting because when you talk about the United Nations, there is no the UN. There are UNs within the UN. It's like a corporation, departments within departments. There's an old guard that has a very structured way of thinking, and there is a new element that is coming in that is very willing to embrace new ideas, and they're doing this. So something very interesting happened. Can I share with you what happened at the UN? So Bruce Lipton and I were co-presenting, me as an earth scientist, he as a life scientist. He's a biologist, I'm a geologist. And so it works very well together. And while we were presenting in the back of the room, the door opened after the presentation began, and some people came and they shuffled in, and they didn't sit down, they were all standing up along the back wall. And it was a little unnerving, as a speaker. I thought, who are these people? And then they all left. And we thought, what was that all about? We discovered later that the UN Secretary General had sent a small delegation to check us out. They wanted to see what we were saying, what we were talking about. And what they took back to him was that they felt it was something that everyone should see. So they turned on the CCTV, the closed circuit television in the UN complex, and anyone that wanted to watch us in that presentation could. Now, we did not know that at the time. It's probably good we didn't know that at the time, because I would have changed my language to speak to a broader audience. But it told me that there is a willingness. It's such a different way of thinking, Brian. When I was in school in 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, I was taught what is called the standard model. It's a standard model of history, the standard model of human origins and evolution, the standard model of history in terms of linear progression from less sophisticated to more sophisticated. Nothing could be further from the truth.
You don't believe that at all?
It's not that I don't believe it. The evidence no longer supports it.
Okay.
I want to be really clear. The evidence, it's not just about belief. It's about being honest with ourselves. We've asked science to tell us who we are, and science is doing a really good job. And the question is, are we willing to embrace the story that science is telling us? And there is a battle playing out. And I will say personally, there is a reluctance, in many cases, a resistance to sharing the new discoveries in the mainstream. So mainstream classrooms, mainstream textbooks, mainstream documentary television refuses to share new science-based discoveries, and they are holding on to an old story, even though and teaching in the schools, even though it's no longer supported.
Why is that? I mean, because I talked to a lot of people in here that are, Graham Hancock, and talking about,
He's a good friend of mine,
the origins of different pieces, and there's always this resistance by the status quo to keep the numbers, to keep the story, to keep the theory of evolution.
Sure.
Well, why is there always such resistance to that?
I think I can boil it down probably to 3 or 4 words: money, power, ego, habit. That's a short answer. A friend of mine who is my friend until we have this conversation in academia, I've asked him once, I said, why evolution, for example? The DNA evidence, very recent, in the last 5 years, the DNA evidence no longer supports the theory of evolution as the mechanism for human origins. Evolution is a fact. And I want to be very clear about that. As a geologist, I've seen it in the fossil record, plants, animals, insects, some primates. Something happened 200,000 years ago, and the theory breaks down when it comes to humans. And the DNA shows us that. The DNA shows us very clearly that we did not descend from Neanderthal, for example. Their genome, we can now rebuild their genome and compare theirs to ours. We can actually, this sounds like Jurassic Park, the movie. Science fiction, but it's science fact. We can pull the DNA.
You can check your percentage of Neanderthal in
We
you,
can pull
right?
the DNA from the bone marrow of fossilized remains of beings that we are supposed to be descended from and compare their DNA to ours. We didn't descend from Neanderthal. It shows that we did appear on Earth about 200,000 years ago.
Where did we come from, Greg?
Well, to answer the question, why aren't we sharing this? When I asked my friend at the university, I said, why can't you share this with your students? And he said, Greg, you don't understand. He says, if I shared that, he said, it would invalidate my 40-year career as a professor. And I said, no. I said, it would do just the opposite. It would demonstrate to your young students how valid and relevant science is, because it's designed to be constantly updated, and you're doing that. It wouldn't invalidate. And he said, well, think how much money it would cost to change the textbooks. And I said, my brother, I said, you're living in the Stone Age. They're not using textbooks. You changed it on the server, and you've changed it everywhere. And he said, well, think of all my class notes I would have to change. And I said, well, that's your job. But that was an example for me of it's a habit. It's a habit, but it's also threatening. And this is why I think it's so important, Brian. It's more than a philosophical conversation. As we globalize, as we push ourselves together and we see the fear of what that means, cultures coming together in different ways of thinking, we also see a rise in hate. And hate is only possible because of a way of thinking. Rachel Carson was an author in the 1960s. She wrote Silent Spring. She was one of the first environmental authors about the use of the pesticide DDT back in the 1960s. And she made a statement. I read this when I was a kid, and it was so powerful. She said, we only destroy the things that we don't value. We have been taught that human life has very little value through the theory of evolution, that we are a random process, genetic mutations. The textbook says that life is a behavior pattern that chemical systems exhibit when they reach a certain level of complexity. That's the definition of life that we're giving to our young people in school today. And it is such a sterile definition. It leaves no room for the specialness and the preciousness of life. And so our young people, through the video games that are very heartless, very violent, through the media, through the television, where are we instilling into our young people how precious and special life is? And if we're going to change that, when we begin to see what the DNA is telling us, it tells us something far beyond random genetic mutations is responsible for us. And that's, I think, where the change in thinking must begin.
Okay. And do we know where we came from at this point? Or do we just know that there's some kind of strange anomaly where 200,000 years ago, new DNA is introduced that couldn't have been more from Neanderthal? We didn't necessarily come from some other mammal form.
We don't know. That's the whole. I released a book in 2017. It's entitled Human by Design. The first half of the book is the peer-reviewed science that is now revealing the facts that tell us that evolution not only is not, but it cannot be our story. And this is the whole point. Science, our young people today in universities are about to dedicate their entire lives to unraveling the mystery of our origin. They're being forced to take every iota, every piece of evidence they find, and force it into a pre-existing story called evolution. Even if it doesn't fit, it's like a square peg in a round hole. If you pound hard enough, it will fit, but it's never a good fit. And there's a huge difference between forcing the evidence into a pre-existing story and allowing the evidence to lead to whatever story it tells. This book is an invitation to do the latter. We don't know what happened, but we do know that where we have been spinning our wheels for 150 years, since Charles Darwin's time. 150 years, the best minds in academia, the best universities, the most advanced technology, the greatest sums of money have been put in to trying to solve this mystery, Brian, and we have yet to come up with one shred of physical evidence that links modern humans with the forms of life that we believe, have been taught to believe, are our predecessors. And if you look at the charts, the Smithsonian Institute, for example, and you look at those very well-known evolutionary family trees, we're up here and all these other forms of life, and we're connected through these lines. If you look closely, the lines are broken lines because they are called inferred or speculative relationships. They're believed to exist, yet no evidence has been found to date. And if we were looking in the right place, I think we would have found something by now.
And whoever makes these rules, they end up having power. And even if it might not be obvious why they're doing it, there is power there. Because if someone can try to convince you that this is the model here, there's all sorts of things that come with that. And then there's the status quo. And like you said, your own relationship to even who we are. So you're saying, look, the facts say this, we need to start, because you're a scientist, you're about the truth and us finding a better outcome with this truth.
Well, within the context of the world that we live in today, this is the key. I firmly believe that when we begin to understand the truth of who we are, the reasons that we hate begin to vanish. The hate is based upon a way of thinking. We've been taught that nature, for example, the fundamental rule of nature is competition, conflict, struggle. And when I say that to an audience, they say, okay, Greg, big deal. Charles Darwin, he said that was 150 years ago, but hey, this is the 21st century. We have the internet. What difference does it make? And it's a really good question. And the young people, when I speak to the young people, they're amazed at the answer. And the answer is, yes, this is the 21st century. And the society that we live in today, the foundations of the society were put into place in the late 1800s. Precisely at the time the theory of evolution was being embraced wholeheartedly by the scientific community. Our economic system is based upon this theory of competition. Our corporate system is based upon this theory. The way we share vital resources, energy, and food, and water in the world, it's all based upon this thinking of competition, conflict, struggle, scarcity. This is what we said to the UN. And as we globalize our world, and we're not turning back. We aren't going to go back to the world. I'm amazed how many people I talk to, some of my family members included, that say, this is a speed bump in the road of life. And they remember what used to be, and they say, well, when things get back to normal, we won't have these problems. I said, well, what do you mean? They said, when things go back to the way they used to be. We've never, as a society, we've never been given the opportunity to mourn the passing of the world that became familiar to us earlier in our lives, and that world is gone, and we cannot go back to a world that no longer exists. And as people begin to embrace that we are now living the new normal moving forward, this isn't a temporary speed bump in the road of life. It's a very, very different way of thinking. But and when I say mourn, I don't mean we have to have a big, outward, sad expression. It is the acknowledgement that the world changed, and so many of the things that were familiar to us no longer exist.
Such as? What's changed? What would we mourn? What was that way of life?
One of the things, I have worn boots all of my life.
I love your boots.
And one of the things I really have noticed is the little mom and pop shops have given way to corporate big box stores and conglomerates and things like that. And one of the places I noticed that is I used to be able to walk down the street, and I mean, this is just a silly example for me, but if I had a problem with my boots, I could walk into a mom and pop boot store and they could fix it in a heartbeat and I'd be on my way. You have to walk many, many blocks to find a store that is willing to work on your shoes these days. But the little, home businesses and the mom and pop kinds of shops, and for me, that's one of the places where I see it showing up. The corporatization of media is a place where I see it. A relatively few number of companies own all the media. The media, different radio stations, different companies, but they're all owned by the same conglomerates.